right, so first class in sci-fi subcreation is the historic novel by Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, famous in Western culture because the novel itself has become pushed into the popular medium of film and popular imagination. And when it does that, it takes on a life of its own because as with all adaptations, there's artistic license, and the cinematographers will either be faithful to the original text or they will try to put their own mark on it in various ways, and some of them are more influential than others, and it's not always the ones that are the most faithful to the text that are the most influential. So we'll get pictures of Frankenstein looking like this guy, with the bolts out of the side of his neck and the square head and excessively large and so forth in various film versions. And we'll even get the spoof takes on it. Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein. If you haven't seen Young Frankenstein, it's rather amusing. That's Victor Frankenstein, by the way, played by Gene Wilder, a favorite of mine. But the actual novel is a very different thing than the view of Frankenstein that we have in our own imaginations, largely because the focus of Frankenstein is as much on the scientist as it is on the creature. And the subtitle of the text will make that clear to us because it is called Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. And that raises a theme which is going to be, we're going to find is increasingly common on this course: the development of Prometheanism as a train of thought in Western culture, seized upon by Mary Shelley in her 1818 novel, but by that point already so widely recognized as a topic that it becomes part of the European imagination. So this is not just a horror story, although it was written in that form and that was how it was originally delivered. I think Mary and her husband Percy and Lord Byron told variations on ghost stories in the summer, the sort of thing you do at summer camps. But this is a very highly literate version, and there's a lot more going on than simply a horror novel, although it is a sort of a horror novel. But it is engaged with science fiction, and it is in particular engaged with what she calls Prometheanism. Now, Prometheus and the Prometheus myth has multiple strands, historically speaking, and the multiple strands are known to Mary Shelley, and she draws upon them. And so let me begin by stating those. And then I'll talk about the contemporary adaptation and the contemporary situation. But the Prometheus myth in its origins is a Greek story of a Titan who steals fire from the gods. That one you probably know about already. Prometheus Pyrphoros, the fire taker. And in accordance with that myth, it expresses something of the fall of the world. Because remember, in Greek thought, there are various ages. It's a cyclical view of history. There's a golden age and a silver age and a bronze age and an iron age. And the golden age is the age actually of Saturn before his son Jupiter rebels against him. Once his son Jupiter rebels against him, it's the beginning of the darkening of the world. So we begin in a golden age with everything in Saturnine perfection, and then Jupiter decides to rebel against his father, And there's a whole series of lesser rebellions that follow on from that. And one of them is the revolt that takes place amongst the earthborn gods against the sky gods being Jupiter himself and the fellow Olympian gods that we know about from Homer, ruling over and having a war with the earthbound gods. And the earthbound gods include Prometheus. And the story is well known, and the consequence is also well known. The sky gods defeat the earth gods, and they throw them down into the underworld and punish them there. Right? We meet them there in the underworld. If you read Homer's accounts of the underworld, you will find that there are titans there, and they're being eternally punished for their revolt against the sky gods. That's not actually told in Homer. It's a background story. If you want the background story, you have to read Hesiod. Oops. I wondered if that one would work. This one should work. Hesiod. Theogony. Sort of contemporary with Homer. Homer is clearly aware of Hesiod's accounts of the origins of things and the battle between the gods, but they lie in the ancient history for Homer. The underworld exists, the gods are already there. He assumes, in other words, a knowledge of Hesiod on our part. Back to Prometheus. Prometheus steals fire from the gods. Now, that gives on the one hand, a very bad view of Prometheus because he's a thief. On the other hand, what does he do with the fire? He gives it to humanity. Now, with that fire, all sorts of things can happen because man masters fire and uses it for his resources. Well, what can you do with fire? Well, you can keep yourself warm. Since we are naked, we can put on clothes, but we don't have fur. We don't have things that protect us from the elements. Fire is a very good thing. You can also cook with it. You can also forge weapons with it. So it has multiple benefits, but what it does is creates human culture. This is an account of human culture, and it has both its positive sides, obviously, cooking and keeping warm. It makes the earth a habitable place, even though there are seasons and different environmental circumstances. But on the other hand, it allows us to forge weapons, and those weapons are things that can be used to kill other things. So it's a mixed gift. And the question is whether the gift is a blessing or a curse, and it's both and. And that story is also true in Frankenstein. So we have to remind ourselves of that in the account of Frankenstein. There's something that's happened here that's good, but ultimately, how good is it? And does it not unleash something unintended, an unintended consequence? We don't need to engage with that, but Shelley is aware of that, and she wants us to be aware of that when we're reading Frankenstein. So that idea that derived from Hesiod of Prometheus as the pir phoros, the fire taker. There's a second strand of that myth, though, and it comes a little bit later, and it's very popular in Roman days. And it's also there, and it's particularly, you can see it in Ovid's Metamorphoses. It speaks of Prometheus. But there he gives us an account of Prometheus that is even more consequential for Shelley, I think. And that is that Prometheus creates mankind even. So here we have Prometheus, to use the Greek, pir phoros. And then in the Greek account, or the Roman account, let's just use Ovid. We have Prometheus plasticator. And that is the Prometheus that gives life to man out of the clay. Very much sounds like a reference to the Genesis account, where God breathes into Adam. and there's a sort of a Gnostic dimension to that, and that's not without significance either. But that strand, the Roman strand of the myth, is also in Shelley's mind. She's aware that, having read Ovid, as every educated person will have done, that there is an alternative account of Prometheus that gives him not only that he gives man the gift of fire, but he also gives them life itself. So in that sense, Prometheus is what in the Gnostic theology we would call a demiurge figure. It's almost like a god character, gives life. So it gives him a much elevated importance, and he becomes a sort of creator. And you can see how this would fit into the story of Frankenstein, because of course Victor Frankenstein, the scientist, gives life to inanimate bodies, patching them together, and and how did they come to life? By means of fire, the lightning that comes from the sky. So he's tapping into those two mythological strands in producing this. And again, the subtitle is telling then, and the idea of Frankenstein as the modern Prometheus, I think almost drops out of the film versions. It's certainly not something that is, I mean, I haven't seen all of them because I'm not really that interested. I find them tedious, but I don't think there's much exploration of the things that would really have interested Mary Shelley in her account, which makes it a great work of literature. It's actually engaging in a very deep, profound area of thought about human nature, about the nature of the fallenness of the world, about the sinfulness of the creator, of the idea of boundaries of civilized behavior which are breached, which offend the gods. In the original account, Zeus. In our account, since Shelley's not a Christian, nor does she believe in God, defies the order of nature. So she has something like a stoic position. Nature is like a goddess, and you're violating nature's rules by digging up grave bound bodies and then patching them together and then fusing them together through the theory of galvanism, which is just harnessing lightning to bring life from into bodies that are dead. And you're desecrating corpses as well. Again, she doesn't object as a Christian. She objects as that it goes against the natural order of things. And Prometheanism, then, in that sense, is connected very strongly with Romanticism itself, and I will add to that the human sciences and the natural sciences, which from the Enlightenment onwards depart from the traditional path of knowledge that they would have had given to them from the ancient world onwards. The ancient world is not seeking to find or invent new uses for the world. You don't see the Greek scientists, for all of their wisdom and for all of their knowledge, trying to harness powers from the earth that are godlike. They dream about it. Yeah, the dreams of flying and so forth that we see in Greek mythology, and flying machines and so forth. And there are dreams there, but there's no actual enterprise or endeavor on the behalf of scientists to try and get these things. And in that sense, modern science is very different than ancient science. And in that sense, modern science is superior to the science that the Greco-Roman world had. They have inventions as well, but their whole raison d'etre is not to invent new things and to create a more powerful human race. A human race that will govern itself and stand above the gods, to see themselves as gods. They are aware of their own mortality, and they are aware of the importance of living a good life. They're not trying to transcend the boundaries of life, namely our death. But in modern Prometheanism, there is an attempt to attain a godlike power and to raise mankind up above his station and above and beyond the limitations of our nature, to transcend them. And Lewis will, and I'm jumping ahead just a little bit here now, in the third installment of his ransom trilogy or his space trilogy or his sci-fi trilogy, whatever you want to call it, that hideous strength, it's based on the Tower of Babel. That hideous strength, and that subtitle makes it clear, and I'll get to this when I actually lecture on it. He's thinking of modern science and the modern education establishment. Remember, the third novel, if you haven't read it yet, you won't remember, but the third novel is based in a modern research university. And there he is referring to that modern research university as something akin to a Tower of Babel. And interestingly, the plot line involves digging up an old body and bringing it to life. Now, whose body is it? It's not a bunch of bodies, it's Merlin. And Merlin is associated with magic, and they want the magical powers of Merlin to fuse it with modern sciences for the sake of power. So Lewis, I think, Lewis would have read this novel and has long thought about the consequences of not just modern science. Lewis is not anti-science, but there's a certain trajectory to modern scientific thinking that transcends the boundaries and limitations of human nature and is willing to violate natural law. In fact, to regard natural law as having no purchase or restraint on our conduct. And he will specifically speak about that in the work that we are going to look at again in a few weeks, but some of you have already read The Abolition of Man, where he talks about the moral law effectively not even being conveyed in our education classes, as if it had no validity to human beings. And that is exactly how Victor Frankenstein acts, by the way. As if the Tao, what Lewis calls the Tao, the moral law, were irrelevant to him. He were not bound by it. And why is that? Because Victor is a scientist. And his efforts are dedicated to one end, and that is to advance humanity. And so he sees himself as being, or he ought to be, and he certainly doesn't recognize himself as being restrained by the limitations of society or even notions of justice or of moral nature. His efforts are dedicated to go beyond those boundaries. And that's represented by his digging up of the corpses and infusing them with life. Note that he does it in secret, so there's a quiet and understated awareness, but it's very well, psychologically well done by Mary, I think, in her depiction of this. He hides himself away to do his experiments in the dark where nobody can see him. So there's an awareness expressed in that he's doing something wrong. And he isolates himself from all of society. And this picture here in the background that I have here is fitting of this again. We have a man, we have a high mountaintop, but we have a man looking out into that, and he's climbed the abyss, but he's not yet climbed the height of it. I'll get to the significance of the mountainscape and it. But what we really have here is something I talked about last semester, which is the typical romantic view of human nature, in which the vantage point of the scientist and the humanities scholar and the romantic poets is represented by Caspar David Friedrich's picture here, which is of us looking into the misty background. Note that we don't see his face. His face is irrelevant. His individuality is irrelevant. It's the view, what Thomas Nagel will call the view from nowhere. Thomas Nagel, a contemporary philosopher. By all means, have a look at it. Thomas Nagel is describing the Enlightenment perspective. Nowadays, politically speaking, we call it globalism. It's acting as if our human nature and the specific locality of it and the specific embodiedness of it, whether male or female, and the specific cultural inheritance was something that was a prejudice that we ought to transcend in order to attain a more perfect human nature, a view from everywhere at all times, expressed by Immanuel Kant. It's the view of autonomy. This is the auto in Greek, or will be the self, and nomi the law. As if you were autonomous, as if you had no law restraining you, as if you were a law unto yourself. But you would not be bound by your culture, you would not be bound by your sex, you would not be bound by your family, you would not be bound by your God, because you autonomously were going to act as if you were a God, standing on the top of the mountain and looking outwards. And that viewpoint, is this a man or is it a woman? Well, it is a man, but there is something here that it could be a woman, because it doesn't matter. His individuality does not matter in the portrait. I don't think Friedrich intends that by what I'm suggesting here, by the way, but note that we don't see his face. And last semester when we read Till We Have Faces, we saw the significance that Lewis placed on faces in connection with love. And that theme of love is a very strong theme in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, by the way. Very interestingly. I'll try and get to that as well. I'm putting a lot of threads out there, and I'm going to try and tie them together at the end. But this view from nowhere is what is represented by this, and it's the view of the Enlightenment man. And the Romantics are similarly wedded to this view from nowhere. And the only difference between the two of them is the Romantics connect themselves back to the world through feeling. The Enlightenment is detached, it's rational, it sees things in abstraction without any particularity of culture, time, place, religious perspective. It's a universality. Right? The aim is universality. And the aim is also in that universality. Well, what do we mean by universality? You've been in my classes a few times, some of you. Universality is often associated with the cosmos. We call it the universe. But the type of universality that we have in mind here is of a universality that transcends even cosmology. Because the view from nowhere is not from another planet, it's from no planets. It's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And the effect of that is to create a view of human nature that has been denatured of humanity and depersonalized to the point at which the human nature is largely an intellectual one and a disembodied one, and bodies will suffer as a consequence. Victor's own body, the body of the monster or the creature, depending how you see it. He was a creature before he became a monster. Monster's just, he's horrified at it, what he's created. And the bodies of his loved ones. Remember, he is a fiancé. He turns away from all those. The Enlightenment scientist is portrayed as somebody who has turned against his own feelings, doesn't care about his feelings. He's detached himself from all sentiment. And intentionally so, because he wants to be a good scientist. And he wants to avoid, I don't have an eraser, and I don't want to do what enrages my wife, which is to wipe it with my sleeve. That was it. I shouldn't have distracted myself with that. He wants to create a view of himself in which there is no prejudice in his life, because he wants to attain universality. So he wants to get rid of prejudice. Remember, the Enlightenment has a hatred of prejudice, which we share, by the way. Nobody wants to be called prejudiced, right? Racism, sexism, classism, all the isms. We don't want to be called prejudiced. But, and this is a point that a writer by the name of Hans-Georg Gadamer observed, at least to me, he observed in a way that I found quite helpful and profound. The Enlightenment had its own prejudice. In seeking to eradicate prejudice, it employed the most prejudiced prejudice of all, namely a prejudice against prejudice. They assumed that all prejudices were evil. That was their prejudice. And it was universal in scope. It had no limitations on it. It was a limitless hatred of limitation. And it expressed the Promethean mindset, the desire to transcend the limitations of their nature, to become as gods. And in that sense, I think as Christians we could say that it expresses the fundamental rebellion of Adam and Eve against God in the garden. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And why? Because they should become as gods, knowing both good and evil. What do we mean by becoming as gods? What do we mean by knowing there? What knowing good and evil? Milton, in his Paradise Lost, will reflect on that profoundly and say, well, what they learned to know, as in a very internal, embodied sense, is they knew evil. And what they learned to know was that they had lost good and gained evil. That's what they came to know. A little bit of a riddle there. They didn't gain more knowledge, in other words. They lost righteousness, and they gained the consequences of their sin, namely the fallenness of their bodies and their ultimate destruction. They will go back to the earth, part of the curse. Shelley's aware of that story, by the way, as well, of course. And so that's the third strand of the Prometheus myth, is that she is going to reflect on that. And the way she does this is by having the Frankenstein creature read Paradise Lost and reflect on it in the middle of the novel. Right? How am I going to do this? Because I actually need this. A hand will work. Imagine that. Genius. Not ideal, but it will work. So the novel is going to play it. So let me, that's a good, interesting beginning. But I mean, I'll run out of time very quickly. But the purpose of this study of Frankenstein isn't actually to read the novel Frankenstein. It's to engage in the themes of Prometheanism and how they play out not only in this seminal work by Shelley, but then are picked up by Lewis and Tolkien in their works. Remember, that's the focus of our study here. But I will say, and I am saying, that both men, Lewis and Tolkien, are aware of this novel, and it is very informative to them, and they're very much interested in the theme of Prometheanism. And you can see it in Lewis's own fiction. We'll get to that, but you can also see it in Tolkien's when they talk about the creation of the Uruk-hai and so forth, the fighting Uruk-hai, in which creatures of different types are bred to create a new and more horrible creature. Now, they're echoing the gods, but now they're doing it in a way that's only malign. That Prometheanism, that's Tolkien reflecting on the same theme as well. What are the limits of the creator? What are the boundaries of creation? At what point is what we do evil and not just scientific exploration? It's not only a Christian objection. It is clearly an objection that is known to Mary Shelley as well. What are the boundaries of the scientist and the artist in this? A deep awareness then of good and evil that we can see is recognized in Scripture as well. In Romans 1, it talks about the heathens, even though they don't know God, will do His will in accordance with their knowledge. So there's a natural awareness of moral boundaries that even the Greeks and the Romans and other ancient Near Eastern cultures will acknowledge in what Lewis will eventually call the Tao, and we will call natural law, or the law of human nature. They're aware of that, and they act in accordance with it. But we, and the modern scientists, and this is the curse of the human condition post-Enlightenment, is that we no longer recognize those restraints as having any legitimacy or hold on us. Such is the allure of the power of the perspective of the view from nowhere. where we look at our own nature as an impediment to our ambition to be as gods. And Victor represents that ambition in of himself. So with that having said, let me look at the structure of the work a little bit. And I think it's, even though this isn't a course that's really trying to study Frankenstein, I do that in other courses here as a novel unto itself, but more as a framing way of looking at the themes for Lewis and Tolkien both. He creates a frame narrative. So there's a story within a story within a story. So it begins with who? It begins with the account of Isaac Walton. And it will conclude with Isaac Walton as well, by the way. Who is Isaac Walton? He's a scientist and an explorer. What is the scientist explorer doing? He is on a voyage to try and circumnavigate the globe through the Northwest Passage. He's gone up into the Arctic and he's got trapped in the ice and the snow. But that's where we begin the account, is through a series. It's an epistolary novel in that sense. It's written through letters. Even the bulk of it, which the middle of it, is still being conveyed to us in letters. We forget it because the narrative goes on so long at that point. But all of this is being told to us by Walton, at least in the beginning. And then the narrator changes. Because Isaac Walton, when he is up in the Arctic, will encounter a very pitiful figure caught in the ice floe, who happens to be Victor Frankenstein, and then Frankenstein will tell us his story, the scientist. And he will tell us his story. And Walton will be listening to that story. And right in the center of that, we will have the creature / monster. And he will tell us his story. The story within the story within the story. So it has this frame narrative in which stories become a part of the narrative. But the overarching one is Isaac Walton, that it begins and concludes with Isaac Walton, who is a man like Victor Frankenstein, who is willing to put his crew's lives at risk to do something for the benefit of humanity, which it's very obvious to the reader, by the way, that this is not for humanity. This is for this vain man's desire for fame. He's willing to risk everything. Who's going to benefit from this? He deludes himself into thinking that he's doing it for everybody's benefit. He's doing it for humanitarian. He's a humanitarian. He's a scientist who thinks he's doing it for everyone else. His crew are saying, we're all going to die. Turn around. He won't do it. He's so committed to his ideal. So he is the scientist / explorer / humanitarian who meets a man just like him, Victor Frankenstein, at this point on an ice floe, chasing another figure who we see dimly in the distance, who happens to be his creature. He's followed him up around into the Arctic, trying to catch him. He's trying to catch him and he's trying to kill him, as absurd as that seems. And then Victor tells us his terrible story of how this came to be, that he was chasing this creature on the ice floe. And that will then go on until very late on in the story. And we will find that in response to Frankenstein's story and what happened as a result of Frankenstein's experiments and his willingness to transcend the limitations of morality and of his creaturely existence and his attempt to play God, Isaac Walton turns the ship around. In other words, he learns the lesson taught by Victor and doesn't follow his example. I'm not going to destroy my own life. I'm not going to destroy the crew. I am going to listen to a different counsel. So in that sense, it's a didactic novel. It's teaching us about the right way to act. You ought to consider the lives of the people around you. You ought to consider your loved ones. You should not seek to do things that are beyond the limitations of your nature. There is great evil in doing that. That's the lesson of Frankenstein. And it's taught to us through the person of Isaac Walton. We see through his eyes, as it were. Question, comment? I thought it's Isaac Walton, isn't it? Is it Robert? It could be. I'll skip over the preface there, but the preface there is rather interesting. Much of the fiction has been supposed by Dr. Darwin. Dr. Darwin is one of the grandfather of Charles Darwin. Erasmus Darwin, early Darwinist, has a certain view of the world, not related to the Christian story, but of evolution. Very interesting. In other words, Shelley is basing her speculation on a common myth about human nature, which is just the speculative fiction of a scientist himself. And by doing that, she says she's not weighing in on religious controversies, but of course she is there. Now remember, Charles Darwin lies in 50 years down the road, like evolution of the species and so forth. That's not yet happened when Shelley writes this. But the theories there, rooted in Erasmus's Darwin speculation about life and how it is interacting with the world around it, that is already there in the mindset of the Promethean mindset of the Enlightenment. So Darwin, when he makes his observations about the origin of the species, is just providing some sort of evidence for a theory that already is potent in the mindset of the scientists of the 18th and 19th centuries. And Mary Shelley recognizes the moral consequences of this view from nowhere and is warning of their wickedness. And a science that is going to be based on Darwinism is not going to lose the effect of Shelley's warning. It remains there. We ought not to do certain things. And in a sense, she's warning us about the very same thing that C.S. Lewis is going to warn us about in The Abolition of Man, namely, if man does not see himself as being bound by a moral law, there's no end to the wickedness he will do, because he will see himself not as a human being under the authority of any law, let alone the law of nature. He will see himself as a law unto himself. And those who are the scientists will rule over the rest of the human race, thinking that they're being selfless when actually they're going to act in a very selfish fashion and be willing to sacrifice the rest of their human beings, just in the same way that Isaac Walton was willing to do it on his voyage, and Victor Frankenstein was willing to do it in his lab experiments. But that's the frame narrative. Now, when the creature tells us his account, he reads a further account, which is the account of Paradise Lost by Milton, the account of the creation of Adam and Eve and the rebellion against God that is contained in it, and he sees himself within that narrative. Very interesting, very telling. And particularly telling is the creature's observation that his plight is worse than Adam's. Because God, in Milton's Paradise Lost, loved Adam, sent his son to die for Adam, created him in his own image, and yet you abhorred me. You didn't love me, and you don't see any resemblance between me and you at all. You're treating me as if I'm just a bunch of stuff, material. And then when you actually succeeded in your experiment, you ran in horror out of the room at me, even though you are the creator of the horror. You ought to be horrified at yourself. You're the cause of the wickedness, not me. And if you would love me, I would be good to you. But because you hate me, my vengeance will be boundless. And it is boundless. Right? So the real monster in Frankenstein, in other words, is not the creature, it's Frankenstein. He's the monster. But it's not even he who's the monster, it's the mindset that's the monster. It's the Enlightenment view from nowhere, which is a monster, and it's predatory on human nature. That's what Shelley is saying. Now, the solution to the problem created by the modern scientist is presented in the form of other figures in the novel. But briefly, the solution to alienation and detachment and the view from nowhere, the autonomous viewpoint, is to love and feel a sentimental connection to all of the other creatures around you, to love them. And that becomes very interesting and potent because, as we saw last semester when we looked at C.S. Lewis's fiction, this theme of love dominates Lewis's own fiction. And yet, in Lewis's fiction, just like in Tolkien's, when we will see that because we've not yet looked at Tolkien's fiction, the view of love that those men hold to is a Christian view of love. And it's not just creaturely affection. It's not just storge. And it's not just friendship, philia. And it's not just eros, erotic love. It will be normed by the love that's not like those other loves, the agape love of God, the grace of God. It's a higher love. It's not like the other loves. And with that higher love, the other loves fall in line because all the other loves end up being disordered without the grace of God. And I quoted again scripture, 1 John 3. This is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and gave his son as a propitiation for our sin. The definition there, and note that it's a definition that has a twofold implication. One, we don't define love from our vantage point. That's the wrong place. That's where Shelley begins. And ends, to that matter, because she never gets the love of God. It means nothing to her. She doesn't understand the grace of God, doesn't reflect on that in her meditations on the Promethean myth and on Genesis. She doesn't account for the gracious character of God at all. She sees it as a myth that's not true, and so she creates her own myth. And secondly, it has a positive implication that here is love, that he first loved us and gave himself as a propitiation, as an atonement. So the cross looms large in Lewis's work just as it will in Tolkien's work, but it will have an effect on the storytelling that ensues. In Mary Shelley's account, the solution to the view from nowhere and the alienation that ensues is an attachment to the world through feeling. It's the Romantics' standard view. All we need to do is pay attention to our feelings. And those are the human side of us. I will note to you, nonetheless, this is the same view from nowhere. It just has feelings attached to it. This man isn't looking into, as we would see here, looking into mist. He's feeling his connection to the mist and the landscape. He feels it. And that will be expressed in painting in the 19th century, the Impressionistic movement, where you can't actually see what is being portrayed very clearly. It's purposefully obscure. Likewise, the music of the period becomes less structured and orderly and rational and harmonious, and it becomes more impressionistic. And it creates a certain feeling in the audience, and the feeling is at that point what the music means. It means something to me. I'll get to that, and I will be talking about it in my class on Milton tomorrow when we look at Milton's Ode on the Morning of Christ's Nativity, where he talks about the significance of music and is laying hold of a view of music that will connect him with cosmology. This view of music does not connect him with cosmology at all. Music is a sort of a feeling that we have that we also create, but it's not connected to a natural order, a natural hierarchy, or any mathematical sense of anything at all. Music starts becoming an art and not a science from the 19th century onward. And this is a seismic shift. Because in the ancient world, and going all the way to the 18th century, music is seen as a science. It's one of the four arts that are connected to the quadrivium, the four ways: mathematics, music, astronomy, geometry. Four ways of understanding the world through number. Note that music is dependent on a sound, and the sound is very clearly and carefully calibrated to a resonance, which you can mathematically measure. So music is closer to science than it is to the humanities, strictly speaking, which are connected to the word. Or it's another way of knowing about reality, but this time through number. And you can hear the number in music. In arithmetic, you just look at the numbers. In music, you hear the numbers. In geometry, you see the numbers, because you can see it in terms of space and time. You can measure it. That's what geometry is. It's measuring the earth. And in astronomy, you're measuring it in pushing it into the heavens. But all of them are ways of understanding the world through number. But from the 19th century onward, music now calibrates not to anything out there that we can see through number, but rather it is based on our sentiments within us that are detached from all those considerations. So it's another form of the view from nowhere, except now the nowhere it's an internalized thing. So the psyche, which connects to that becomes the basis for the modern discipline that we call psychology, is now petted to a view of the psyche that begs the question of, well, what do we mean by the psyche? Yeah, what is the thing that we regard as essential to us that nonetheless is detached from any particular individual human body? It's clearly central to who we are. But it becomes effectively our feelings. So psychology is a discipline that studies our feelings. And yet our feelings that are not bound by natural law, and they're not strictly bound by, certainly not bound by the law of God, any relational connections, let alone the authority of the relational connections, as in God's rule over our lives and our relation with him, or our relationship with our families, or our relationship with our world, which we have expressed through the Christian faith. It will be solely based on how we feel towards one another. And so Mary Shelley's solution to the problem of alienation is love, but the love is just sentimentality. It has no transcendent capacity. It has, if you will, a horizontal dimension, but it never has a vertical dimension. It cannot actually engage with the cosmological problems of good and evil that the way the Christian faith can and does. And so the question is whether the solution is better than the problem, but I will simply say, I don't want to judge upon that. I will say it is an expression of the same problematic perspective. It assumes the truth of the Enlightenment. It just tries to put a patch on it. This is Enlightenment 2.0. It's got feeling, but it's still the view from nowhere. Now that expresses itself in the novel in various ways. And let me get to the novel here. I'll get rid of Mel Brooks and Frankenstein's monster. We'll look at him one more time. Yeah. And now to the novel. But she talks about this and talks about the truth of the elementary principles of human nature. There we go. This is very interesting. That makes it a theological treatise, by the way. If you're going to deal with the elementary principles of human nature, refer to Erasmus Darwin, then you are engaging with something that you're saying something that's true about human nature, not just in your age, but in every age. The elemental principles. And I have not scrupled to innovate upon their combinations. She sees it in the Iliad, she sees it in the tragic poetry of Greece, Shakespeare, The Tempest, Midsummer Night's Dream, and most especially Milton. Most especially Milton. Yes, but what reading of Milton? What understanding of Milton? Famously, the Romantics saw Milton recognizing that he was a Christian and intended Christian things, nonetheless speaking to a truth that transcended the particularity of the Christian religion, which they thought was a stage towards the Enlightenment view, where they could dispense with this doctrine of sin. and move to a more universal perspective in which we could talk about the brotherhood of man, the universal brotherhood of man. That's what the French Revolution was fought on, right? And they set up a temple to reason and so forth. The goddess reason. And the Romantics are horrified to some degree about the detachment, the killing, the murder, but they're committed to the same thing. They just think that love is going to fix it all. And our contemporaries tend to agree with them. Love is love. You know, the Paris Olympics, where they had this ridiculous pastiche of the Last Supper, where they got this gender questionable man in blue on top of the as part of the Last Supper. He's being feasted up, and the disciples are around, their bearded ladies, and so like it's all sorts of weird, confused, mixed messages, but clearly an attempted, poke in the eye to Leonardo's painting of the Last Supper. But it's a sort of inclusive, loving, all you need is love, Beatles type sentiment. And sentiment's going to solve the problems of the world. So it is a sort of religious perspective. Do you want to comment? I don't want to get off on. Yes. Also. But it's clearly, you can see if you look at Leonardo's Last Supper and Jesus in the middle and the disciples all around. But there is a bacchanalia part of it. Well, and again, that just makes the point. So how do we bring about this lovingness? Well, through orgiastic actions. So it's an orgiastic, sexual, promiscuous indulgence that is going to transcend the problems of the world. Like it's as absurd as The View from Nowhere, and just more vulgar and more disgusting. But it's the same thing. And in both cases, they don't have a right view of human nature. Although this is about human nature. Note that she says, I have endeavored to preserve the truth of the elemental principles of human nature. And to do that, she actually sees Milton as proving her case. Now, you have to have a very odd reading of Paradise Lost to come up with the idea that Milton proves your point, most especially Milton. But nonetheless, she does have that view. And so briefly, what is her view of Milton's Paradise Lost? It is that Milton, and I think Blake will speak for her on this, that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, because he expressed a sense, Blake doesn't read Milton as holding to theological truths, or if he does, that's less relevant than the fact that he speaks to poetic truths that transcend the particularities of the tale. And what we have in the character of Satan is a being who is impassioned and zealous for justice and desirous of nothing other than his own autonomy from God's unfair and unjust rule. And so the hero of Paradise Lost for the Romantics is actually the devil. And such is the artist, according to Blake and all the Romantics. The artist is a expresser of human imagination and feeling that they think that all true art has always expressed. So again, the Romantic view of human history, and that they will include everything from the Iliad all the way through Milton, is that it's just expressing Romanticism over and over and over. Anyone who's done my courses will know that I could not disagree with that more strongly. But that's their reading. And it is the dominant reading of Lewis and Tolkien's day as well. All these foregoing works are just foreshadowing of the view of the Romantics. And the Romantics tell us that love conquers everything. And sentiment. And that's Shelley's take-home message. And so how does she express this contrast? Because there is a contrast between two types of characters here. On the one hand, we have Victor Frankenstein. Now, Victor Frankenstein, there was a pop cultural book, I don't know how many years ago now, 15 years ago. It was Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. Have you heard of that book? was pop culture. But it was talking about men as being like Mars, Ares, the god of war. They were, whereas women were like Venus, loving, whatever. And there was a contrast between the two of them. And I've expressed it and said that it's expressed culturally in various forms. But one of them is to see Mr. Spock as an expression of that in the original Star Trek series, or Mr. Data. You know, someone that is only motivated by logic and reason. And on the other hand, you have the other side of it, which is a character that's motivated only by feeling. Whether it's Dr. McCoy in the original series or Counselor Troy in the later Star Trek episodes, she's an empath. The captain, Picard, asks her for her input into making a good decision, and she says, how do you feel? And she says, I feel conflict with him. She's consulting with her feelings, and her feelings are the means of giving counsel here. And Data is giving the rational, so you get the two sides. You get the head and you get the heart. That's more or less the Enlightenment and the Romantics. Both of them, I think, are wrong. But that is what the modern period sees as the fundamental conflict between the arts and the sciences, whether you're going to listen wholly to your reason or whether you're going to wholly listen to your feelings. But in both cases, their understanding of reason is an irrational one. Likewise, their feelings, because it's an unbounded reason. It's not circumscribed by time and space. It's a universal reason. It's marked by a prejudice against prejudice. And so that is how Shelley tells this tale. And she does it, as I say, through a series of epistolary novel or just say epistles to Mrs. Saville back in England from St. Petersburg. So at this point on the voyage, they are up in the northwest area of what we now call Russia, ancient city, and they've left London and they go forward, and he writes this series of novels. And as he goes on, novels, letters, he tells the story of this, but he's writing them back to a beloved back home. So Walton is writing, he's left his loved ones to go on this voyage for the sake of humanity. He's left his loved ones behind, and he talks about how he misses them and so forth, but for the good of the cause, I'm going to keep on going. And note that he mentions here, and this is well done by Shelley, there's a place called Archangel, but she's already evoking the sense of Satan here. But on the way to Archangel, and I'll depart for the latter town in a fortnight or 3 weeks, and my intention is to hire a ship there and to go on from that. So second one writes it back to his sister. And how long is it after the first one? It is March 28th. Oh, so it's 3 months, 3.5 months. And as he goes on, eventually he runs into the figure of none other than Victor Frankenstein. So the third letter is written, that's letter 2. Letter 3, another 3 months on, and we're in the middle of July at this point. And he sends the letter back through somebody he meets along the way who will send it, carry the letter back, etc. No incidents have befallen us, etc. The fourth is a little bit further on, and at this point, it's August and the ice is breaking up. So they get to move, and they see on all sides fog, nearly surrounded by ice, and fog, a very thick fog, and they can't see where they're going, but they're in an icy landscape. By the way, let me say some other thing about this final thing with respect to the icy landscapes here. It may have occurred to you this already, but since the time of Dante, ice is associated with hell. At the bottom of the Inferno, contrary to our expectations if we haven't read the Inferno, it is not a fiery, hot place like we would get from a biblical understanding of hell. It is a place in which as the further down you go, the colder it gets and the more encased in ice it is. So when Walton goes on his Arctic exposition, he's going into a hellish landscape. He's going to a place of illicit activity to some degree. It's certainly not hospitable to mankind. Likewise, the landscape that we will see will be there for Victor Frankenstein is that none other than the Swiss Alps, and more particularly Mont Blanc, which is a place that every writer from the 18th century on is going to associate with the sublime. This is an aesthetic category. And it is associated particularly with Mont Blanc, which plays prominently in Shelley's novel. And so what is the significance of Mont Blanc? And what is the significance of the sublime? The sublime has certain connotations, which by this point, and to really get into the deep weeds of this, you need to go back to my literary theory course, which some of you took and others have not yet taken. The sublime, come the 18th century, is dissociated and in fact categorically opposed to the beautiful. By none other than the great conservative political author Edmund Burke. Burke is the key figure here in separating the two. Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, follows Burke in his separation and contrast between the sublime and the beautiful. But briefly, the sublime is associated with our sense of power over nature. This sense of power. I'm at the top of the mountain looking down on everything. The Palace of Versailles, created in France, is similarly situated above the landscape. So when you look out actually from Versailles, you actually see nothing on the horizon whatsoever. It's the view of the gods. You've transcended human limitations. Or if you will, if you want to add a Christian spin on it, it's the view of the Tower of Babel. It's the view from nowhere that allows you to see out from a God's eye perspective. So the sublime expresses our feeling of a sense of power over nature, and it expresses our ability not to see things. So there are various sublime landscapes. One of them is looking out over a vast ocean where you can't see the horizon, a sense of limitlessness. Now that doesn't express our power over nature, but rather our powerlessness in the face of that. The Romantics flip it around and say, well, the reason why we feel powerlessness is because our feelings create that feeling of powerlessness, because all thought actually comes from our feelings. So if we feel powerless in the face of this huge ocean in which we feel our smallness, we have to recognize that that feeling of powerlessness is one that we create. It's not actual powerlessness, because all feelings come from us. They don't come from nature. We are the creator of our own feelings. So if we feel powerless, that's because we have the power to feel powerless. And the Romantics regularly write about sublime landscapes then. Another form of this is the ruin, like Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, written about a ruin. Because in a ruin, we see the effects of nature destroying a great landmark of civilization, namely an abbey, which took centuries to build. Centuries of human effort destroyed by the wind and the weather, just slowly eaten away. And that expresses a power that we can't see and can't control, but we can feel. And so the Romantics regularly talk about this power and the sublime. And note the power of the sublime is the power over nature, power over nature. And we feel our power with the sublime. Whereas in the beautiful, it's sort of flipped around. What we call beautiful is something that we likewise feel powerful over. but in an immediate fashion. So the reason men call women beautiful is because they feel more powerful than them. Their bodies are smoother, softer, weaker, makes men feel their own sense of power, and that makes them call this beautiful. Likewise, women feel that babies are beautiful because they're weaker, softer, whatever, so it's beautiful. We say the same thing about certain types of animals. Not fierce animals, but baby animals. Little baby, children love baby animals. They actually will lose their mind if they see a little animal getting killed even. Makes them crazy. They can't watch, can't look. Terrible thing, some people to this day, because they make associations with all of that feeling. But that's the sense of the beautiful here, where we have a sense of our own power over nature, and at the same time we apply it to us. In both cases. Here we feel powerless in the face of nature. Here we feel powerful in the face of nature. But in both cases, we're the creator of that feeling. And there is a gendered component to this, as it were. The male figure of Walton and the male figure of Frankenstein are acting in the pursuit of the sublime and care nothing about the beautiful. And they're willing to sacrifice the beautiful. They're willing to leave it behind. And they do sacrifice it, by the way. And so they're presented as monstrous in their pursuit of sublimity and power. Whereas Shelley suggests that the way in which we will redress the problem of the pursuit of the sublime is being more attentive to the beautiful, to that feeling within us that attaches us to things that are weaker than us. So don't attend to the sublime like the scientists attend to the beautiful, like, well, who are the list of characters that we could say are associated with this? Well, we meet them very early on in Victor's life. Who do they meet? Early on. This is Victor, and he's meeting Captain. It is Robert Walton, you're right. It's not Isaac. Little dialogue here. One day I mentioned to him the desire I'd always felt of finding a friend who might sympathize with me and direct me by his counsel. I said I did not belong to that class of men who are offended by advice. I am self-educated. And perhaps I hardly rely sufficiently upon my own powers. I wish, therefore, that my companion should be wiser and more experienced than myself to confirm and support me, nor have I believed it impossible to find a true friend. I agree with you, replied the stranger, in believing that friendship is not only a desirable but a possible acquisition. I once had a friend, the most noble of human creatures, and am entitled, therefore, to judge respecting friendship. You have hope and the world before you, and have no cause for despair. But I have lost everything and cannot begin life anew. As he said this, his countenance became expressive of a calm, settled grief that touched me to the heart. But he was silent and presently retired to his cabin. Now, this is Robert Walton reflecting on his experience with Victor Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein's essay is a negative example of what Walton should do. Don't do what Victor does. You're like Victor, don't do the full Victor. And he doesn't. In the end, he pulls back and is moved by his love of his family and by the love of the creatures around him to avoid the problems created by a sole focus on the sublime. Now, the sublime is associated with science, and the arts and humanities are associated with the beautiful, and they're repeatedly associated with the beautiful. And so one of his friends very early on was Henry Clerval, who loved reading stories and poetry and spent his life with those stories. They fed his soul. He loved the old stories. He loved his family. Victor had no interest in the stories and to some degree, had no interest in his family. The Romantic solution to the problem of the Enlightenment is to bury yourself in texts and to avoid science altogether. Again, for Lewis and Tolkien, who I'm leading up to, the solution is not to bury yourself in the humanities, but rather to find a perspective that will include both the humanities and the sciences. In other words, it's the view of the seven liberal arts. Again, a sort of a fusion of the humanities and the sciences, expressed in the unity of the trivium and the quadrivium. But for now, we have a fractured portrait. And Shelley is presenting, again, the trivium as the solution to the quadrivium, if you will. So the way of the word is the way of addressing the problem of the way of the number. Does that make sense? I don't know if it does. Yes? Okay, yes?
Sorry, I just haven't heard these terms quadrivium and trivium.
Thank you. Thank you. Seven liberal arts are the subjects of a traditional university's curriculum in the medieval period, not just the medieval, but in the ancient world. And as I say, there are seven. There are those of the trivium, or the three paths. Trivium, yes. And there is the quadrivium, the four paths. And under the trivium, we will have grammar and dialectic or logic. And we will have rhetoric. And under the quadrivium, we will have four paths: mathematics, music, geometry, and astronomy. Now, what do these three have in common, and what do these four have in common? As I say, these are related to words. These are the sciences, if you will, or the studies that relate to words, and these are the ones that will relate to numbers. They are two different ways of understanding the world that God has created around us. Two different ways. You can do it through numbers, and you can do it through words. When I say two different, they're different in the sense that they're apprehended through a different means, but note that all of them are knowledge and all of them are connected together. You still use words to understand and express musical truth, likewise mathematical truth, although in really advanced mathematics, you get into symbolic representations of things and so forth. And you can't even express it verbally, which I think is a problem to some degree. Because words are the way that we try and understand things and limit their moral consequences. And maybe that's the problem of the advanced sciences. But they're, roughly speaking, are what we now call the arts, and these the sciences. But as I said, the effect of some of this, and particularly the Romantics' view on feeling, is to take music and throw it into the arts, as if it were an arts subject. I've never met anyone who thought that, who's studying music, that think that they're in the sciences. Never met anyone. And that's because, again, modern music understands itself to be expressing feeling. But that is and while there's some truth to that, the feeling that they express is still connected to mathematically precise frequencies, and is connected to an embodiedness that's part of living in the world, and it's connected to a sense of the astronomy connected to the music of the spheres. There's an ideal sense of music. Transcendent, the best music makes us feel a sense of transcendence. That's even the voices that we have in a choir. The sopranos, the high sopranos are, they're touching on a part of us that the low tones of the bass are not. That's more earthly, more visceral. Down, you feel it in our guts, the drums, and then the high soprano, that's making us lift ourselves up. So in music, we get the sense of embodiedness being expressed in it that does truly relate to our feelings, but it ought to relate to knowledge as well, and not just feeling. And now it becomes all feeling. Well, so do all these things become distorted by the Romantics' view of the imagination expressing our feelings primarily. So just a great distortion of the whole intellectual landscape is going on here. But this fellow, Henry Clerval, is one of the figures that represents the female, the feminine side of things. He's interested in poetry. One thing that has struck people over the years is that Mary Shelley, and I didn't say this to you because I didn't want to get into a study in Shelley per se, but she is the daughter of the most famous feminist of her day, Mary Wollstonecraft, author of The Vindication of the Rights of Women, a response to Thomas Paine's Vindication of the Rights of Man. And she gendered it. She gave it as if the men were excluding women, which I don't think Paine intended, but she explicitly gave a feminine take on that, and she died in childbirth. So she never knew her, but still she's the daughter of a famous feminist. Her husband, or her father rather, Thomas Godwin, was a famous Enlightenment pamphleteer and novelist, and wrote on social justice, by the way. That's another interesting thing, but political justice and social justice, and I won't get into that here, but for the point that's been observed is Mary Shelley, the daughter of a famous feminist, why does she not have female heroes that we can look up to? You would expect the heroes to be like boss girl Galadriel in the Rings of Power, going around and beating down the men, outmanning the men, you know, being Wonder Woman or whatever the Marvel characters, women doing men things better than men. But that's not what she does. She portrays the women as being victims of the men's pursuit of sublimity and carelessness. The women are universally victimized. As I say, universally, without exception. It's not that their perspective is being ridiculed, it's being promoted. But they say, in the end, when it comes to if men will not be regulated by the beautiful and only observe the sublime in their pursuits, women will die. And the Frankenstein creature himself is feminized in the sense that he sees himself as passive and a victim of the power of Victor. And ultimately, Victor, he tries to extort from Victor a promise to create a female creature like him. And Victor starts doing it out of fear of losing his own loved ones here, because the monster threatens them. He, in the end, tears because he looks out and he sees the face of the creature in the window, and instead of bringing the female creature to life, tears it apart, and it's called an abortion. And again, and the Frankenstein creature himself refers to himself as an abortion. I was like an abortion, an unwanted life. In modern political culture, it obviously has resonances that it probably didn't so strongly in his day, but the scientist literally is willing to abort in order to have control over life, which he sees as the ultimate good. Without getting into the whole abortion debates and so forth, but it is inherent in this perspective of the scientist and the way that they view life. So I'll do further this, you can see that. I haven't got very far into it, but I didn't really want to. I wanted to give you the outline and the resonances here. So the sublime is there, the idea of the creator and his responsibility to his creature is there. Lewis will mention these resonances. You will hear them in the background of all three of his sci-fi trilogy episodes. In Out of the Silent Planet, you will get the perspective of the scientist in relation to the creatures, the Malacandrians he meets. The scientist thinks that we can kill them all. Why? So we can populate Malacandria with human beings. Who cares? We'll create the canvas. Well, we have to wipe the map clean. It's the view from nowhere. It doesn't matter if there's something that's obstructing the view from nowhere that I want to ideally create, well, then I'll just wipe it all out. All the pieces come off the board. He's not bothered by that at all. Whereas Ransom recognizes in the creatures that he meets fellow rational beings, feels a sense of accountability for them, responsibility, and tries to understand their language, and does learn their language, in fact. And likewise, when he goes to Paralandra is on Venus, which is, of course, connected with the sense of the goddess of love, and it revisits Paradise Lost. So it's, again, Lewis reading not just Paradise Lost, but also reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in the novel. As I say, the creature Frankenstein reading Paradise Lost and reflecting on it. Lewis will be reflecting on Paradise Lost, yes, but also Shelley's Frankenstein and what the creature thinks in relation to that. And then finally, when he comes to the third iteration in That Hideous Strength, it will be talking about the whole enterprise of the modern research university as a sort of Tower of Babel in which they're willing to do pretty much anything for the sake of their power and enrichment. And what Lewis adds as an additional feature, it's true of all three novels, is there's a supernatural dimension to that. There are demons that lie behind the whole battle and storyline, become more pronounced as each story is told. By the time you get to the third novel, it's particularly strong. But I think that's why I put this novel on the course. I think you need it. It's necessary reading to understand the whole genre and the storylines of the genre, which I think that Mary Shelley delineates for us very powerfully. So I'm sorry I've run out of time. I can talk about this novel all day. There's a lot there. It's a really rich seam to tap into and to speak about. But I think we've done enough there to get a sense of what we're going to do with it, which is to read Lewis and Tolkien in the light of that, and then to reflect on that as Christians, and the theme of love, and the theme of human nature, which is not the view from nowhere. It's the view from a particular place. And remember, in the incarnation, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that same Word, which became a being, was also the Word that created the whole world. Right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and by Him all things were created, and nothing was made that was made, etc. So those connotations of embodiedness and yet also creative power and rationality, etc., all of those are in play in this discussion on this course. Okay? Anyway, I'm done for today. Thank you.